Guillermo. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on. I would love to hear where are you from, what's your background, why research, why did you choose to do sports nutrition, and why you are where you are. Tell me just a little bit about yourself.
Perfect. Well, I was originally born in Costa Rica, but I moved to the United States with my family as a very young kid at 9. So I lived most of my life in California, actually. I lived a little bit in Texas, but most of my life I've been in California. And I went to college out here for my bachelor's and my master's. I did my doctorate in Utah at Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions. And my undergraduate degrees were in athletic training and biology. Well, I have a minor in biology, and then I have a master's in business administration with concentrations in marketing and healthcare management. And my doctorate is in athletic training. The reason I pursued that over the years was because exercise, fitness, health was always part of my lifestyle. I was an athlete growing up, and I didn't have the best genetics for sports, but I wanted to be a good athlete. So I knew that I had to work really hard to excel in sports. So that drove me to try to learn how to exercise appropriately, how to be in shape. So I would show up in shape to my practices and try to really outwork the competition. And then as I started studying a little bit more and reading, even as a young kid, I realized the importance that nutrition played in enhancing your performance. So even at my first nutrition book I got when I was 12 years old, there was a lot of wrong information in there, but it gave me a start nonetheless. And I was able to start implementing just being conscientious of healthy eating. And I really saw the impact that it had in my sports performance. So the combination of exercise and the nutrition really drove me to continue pursuing that further. And the rehabilitation piece of that came together because naturally I got injured through my sporting career. So then my other component was, how do I prevent these injuries? And when I do get injured, how do I get back on the field faster? So collectively, when I got to college and I saw that, wow, I could study the physiology, the anatomy, I could study the rehabilitation, the injury prevention, the exercise physiology. It really, everything made sense. So that's why I pursued my passion in health, fitness, and wellness.
That's amazing. I do love the part of rehab because I think there's a mindset of, well, if I'm injured, I'm just screwed. Nothing is possible, but you could work around it, do obviously your rehab so you can get back on track slowly, but work around the injury as well. I see a lot of people, like when they get injured, they just stop doing everything. But also I guess there is a component of the emotional and the mental health component where they think, well, I'm not in my best shape. I can't perform as I used to. I don't feel like I would be doing what I like to do, or they have to modify things around. And sometimes I might just be somehow depressed because of the situation. I don't know. It could be so much different things. So just briefly on that, how would you deal with someone who has injured, for example, let's say someone who goes to the gym, they like going and training, and they probably injured their shoulder or, or one of the limbs or articulations. What would you tell them, or what would be your, like, some of your words to let them know that it's okay, we can work around it, let's move on, let's look at your, how you look at your nutrition to make sure you're doing the right thing, and we try to maintain whatever you have achieved up until now, and then we can just make sure we prepare you the best we can before you can just get back on track on 100%.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked that question because it's very true. There is a very big emotional connection to, especially if you're really serious about health and fitness and you go to the gym consistently, it becomes part of your lifestyle. And when you get that taken away via an injury, it's hard to overcome that. So I think one of the biggest things that I always say is, do the things that you can do. So for example, if you say that maybe you injure your shoulder, okay, well, there's a lot of things that you can train that aren't related to your shoulder. You may have to modify some of them. So maybe doing a squat, putting your hands in this position, maybe you're uncomfortable. Okay, so maybe you can try a front squat. You can do a leg press. You can do a lunge with dumbbells. You can do squats with dumbbells. So there are hundreds of other exercises that you can do that you can still train other body parts. You can also, a lot of the rehab process is also going to involve therapeutic exercise. So you need to spend some time strengthening those areas, because why do you get injured to begin with? So you need to maybe strengthen the rotator cuff, strengthen the scapula stabilizer. So there are other smaller muscles maybe that you don't necessarily pay attention to on a regular basis that you can now start focusing on, and then it'll help potentially prevent further injuries further down the line. And it may even help your performance after you recover from that injury. And then other things you can do are, there's research talking about unilateral training. So if you injured, let's say you have a surgery and you're in a sling and you can't move your right arm. Well, you can train your left arm and your right arm will benefit. And actually there'll be some crossover effect in some of these. So, and nutrition is another big part. There was a recent article just published by a group at North Carolina with Abby Smith. And they actually published an entire paper talking about the importance of nutrition and how that's often disregarded. And you're right that a lot of people just say, well, I'm just not going to eat. I'm going to stop all my supplements. They usually eat a lot less because then there may be fear of getting fat. But in order to heal, they actually need to appropriately feed their body. And there's actually a metabolic cost for the muscle or the tendon or the ligament to heal. So very much like building muscle, we need to feed the body appropriately, adequate calories in general, enough protein, adequate carbohydrates, and then you may even supplement accordingly to actually help in the recovery process. So those are things that are often neglected from the individual. And lastly, you can work on your cardiovascular health, because some things that might be neglected. So you can do, you can still maintain your body composition and work on other things that maybe you don't spend as much attention doing.
Going to the part of the nutrition and trying to sort of eating kind of at maintenance might be like a little bit of a fine line there, because like someone might be training much less. Like maybe we have on one stream these athletes or people who can auto-regulate really well their appetite when they're no longer training as much. But there are other part of the population that even if they are not training anymore, they cannot auto-regulate very well their appetite. And usually because of the emotional, they doing less, they bored, they probably emotionally eat, they are more likely to gain weight and not eat necessarily healthy or nutritious, a nutritious diet. So in this case, when we have these two potential scenarios, what would be some of the specific recommendations when it comes to calories, protein, like really getting into, well, you should be aiming for this amount of calories, this amount of protein to just make sure you're not gaining weight, and you're able to maintain your lean body mass, but at the same time you are providing enough fuel to your muscles to recover, to the area of the injury to make sure it's having all the building blocks to get back on how it was before, and really paying attention to little things that could make things just a little bit more risky in terms of weight gain without trying. For example, just eating more highly palatable foods that you shouldn't be choosing, because they tends to just create this sort of wave of cycle wanting to eat more, even if you were thinking about it. So what would be your recommendations in a specific macronutrient prescription for these conditions, these situations in these two cases?
Yeah, I think a couple of things you touched on. Well, one is finding that elusive, what is maintenance? I think that's something that is often difficult to figure out. So you can obviously try to use one of these calculations, RMR calculations, to estimate, and then maybe kind of start with that, and then add an activity level factor. One thing that you want to take into consideration is maybe you were training 10 hours a week before you were hurt, and then now you're hurt and now you can only train 4 hours a week. So obviously your activity level is going to be less than it was when you were fully training. But you also have an injury. That injury has a metabolic cost in order for it to heal. So you can't really go back to, let's say that difference in calorie for maintenance was 300 calories a day on average. So you can't really cut back those 300 calories, because now your shoulder, let's say that's what's hurt, it actually still needs to heal. So it needs some calories to do that. So you might need to increase that maintenance by an extra 15, 20, 25%, depending on the type of injury that occurred, or the severity of the injury. Was it a surgery that occurred? Was it a fracture? And you can increase the calorie intake. So now you have a new maintenance. And once you have that determined, then the first thing I always like to do is, estimate protein intake. So typically, at least at 1.6 grams per kilo would be the absolute minimum, but I always like to buffer it with a little bit of insurance. So I say anywhere from 2 to 2.2 is a good way to go about it. And in regards to focusing on not regaining weight, if we can keep the protein at that higher content, it's got the highest thermic effect of food. We know that if we happen to overeat the protein, there's been several studies to show that you may not even gain as much body fat as if you overeat the other foods. So if you're going to err on the side of caution, then overeat the protein rather than the other foods. So we can err on the higher side of that. Then we're going to need the carbohydrates, but we don't want to neglect the fats as well. So I usually put the fat at around 20 to 25%. And then the remaining amount would be in the carbohydrate component, which is going to be essential, again, for your rehabilitation process. And I think one thing that people often forget about carbohydrates, even though they don't increase muscle protein synthesis when taken in conjunction with protein, they do actually help to attenuate muscle protein breakdown, which then increases net protein balance. So I think you have to marry the two to do it. So even though I'm not going to get any more synthesis, I'm going to get less breakdown, which means a higher net protein balance, which is what we want to be able to build and to heal.
And this is due to the production of insulin, which is the hormone that is sort of protecting your lean body mass from breakdown, isn't it?
Partly, and partly due to insulin and the insulin growth-like factor that goes with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's that conversion. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of good benefits to the carbohydrates. Not to mention that it's going to also enable you to be able to train harder. So if you deplete your glycogen levels from a workout session, now you eat the carbohydrates, you're going to replenish those glycogen levels, and then when you go train again, you're not working without fuel. You have fuel available to be able to push the intensity of your workouts at a higher level. So if you're constantly with a low tank of gas with low glycogen levels, then you're not going to be able to maximize your workout, which is then going to inhibit your gains.
No, I agree 100%. Now, let me ask you something in regards to same process of rehab, and maybe now looking at someone who is, I don't know if you work with elderly or people that are more like in advanced age, that they trying to sort of rehab, but they get this usual question and request from the doctors like, well, like you hurt your knee, we're doing a knee replacement or hip replacement, but you need to lose weight. But the problem with losing weight, being hurt already because you need a surgery to get better, it's like a catch-22. You're not in your best shape to actually exercise and optimize all the different strategies to optimize that weight loss. But at the same time, you need to do it because it's part of the, like in terms of the surgery, you maybe if you lower your body fat, you have less risk of complications after surgery or things like that. So where would you like, I don't know whether that's an area you have worked with before, but what would
yeah,
be
I have a lot of experience in that, definitely.
Okay, so what would be your recommendations for this person? Like they have to lose weight, but how they go about increasing their exercise activity if they're limited, but at the same time there's the limitations of, well, I have the problem of the pain, I can't even walk very much. And the diet is so tricky. So what would you say in that situation?
Well, it actually brings. There was a client when I owned my practice several years ago before I went into academia. I had a lady who was over 300 pounds, and she had really bad knees. And exactly the story that you said. Doctor says, "Well, we need to get you to lose weight before we have you do the total knee replacement." And they did one knee, then the other. And I remember, really, it is a challenge because she's limited. She can't walk very well. Her health is already not in an ideal state. she's severely obese. So what we did is, you just have to meet the client where they are, and you have to work within the pain-free range of motion. You might need to start with isometric type of activities. I put her on the bike at first, and she thought I was crazy, and she couldn't go all the way around on the bike. But she could go part way on the bike, and she could move around a little bit. So, but we started basically little by little. Same thing when I showed her a wall squat. Ideally, I told her I want you to get down to close to 90 degrees. Of course, she was never able to get there before the surgery. She could only go down maybe 2 or 3 inches, but that's what we did. It was pain-free at that point in time. And then over the course of a few weeks, she got stronger within that range of motion. Then we're able to increase the range of motion. And we were able to actually program her rehabilitation to be able to give her the caloric expenditure. And then, of course, focus on the nutritional aspect, which was basically more of like we did put her on a caloric deficit, but it really wasn't excessive because she was so sedentary before that just increasing her caloric expenditure by 150 calories 3 days a week, and then in an additional maybe 50 to 100 calories every day doing home exercise program, and then reducing her calorie intake by about 500 calories a day. That in itself really worked very well. And then, of course, we focused on, again, improving the quantity of fruits and vegetables she was eating, and as well as the quantity of protein that she was eating. And then you combine all those things together, and it really made for a very successful outcome. And I'm just using one example, but that happened, in many other scenarios with similar patients over and over the years.
I see in the terms of the nutritional management, sometimes you might find that the doctor is pretty much on top of it, like they want the patient to lose, like especially if they're inpatients, like they're about to have the surgery about 3 weeks in 3 weeks time or 4 weeks time. Like, I want you to lose as much weight as possible, and they put them on these very, very low calorie diets, like only 3 shakes a day. In your opinion, how feasible is to do that for, I would say, for a short period of time, like you're doing that for 4 or 5 weeks, in terms of reducing the body weight as much as possible to get them to the surgery? Do you think it's something that is not as optimal, or is actually a good strategy?
No, I actually, I actually had some conversations with some physicians that would take that approach, and I would usually call them and I would talk to them, and I would just really try to encourage them to do another approach, which was maybe a more a slower approach, to maybe let the patient, there's no need to lose all this weight in 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. I would say, let's give her 3 or 4 months of actually doing the program. So now we can actually lose 10, 15 pounds of body fat slowly, not maintain the lean body mass, and then they can actually heal a lot better. So my approach would be, if you depriving the body of all of that, then when they come out of the surgery, they're not going to be able to hear very well. You're probably going to lose. They're going to lose some water weight, a lot of water weight. They're going to lose a lot of lean body mass on top of that, and actually muscle mass, because the water weight is lean body mass, but they're going to lose muscle mass on top of that. So these are not, you're stacking the cards against you, not for you. So I don't think it's a good strategy. I think a basic lifestyle strategy to implement that over the time period is usually better. And not only that, but we know that those diets, even though you're successful in the short term, in the long term, you're gonna gain all that weight back and then some, which is gonna make it harder for them to recover, especially now when they have a new knee or a new hip. Now they're gonna gain all that weight back with interest, and they're gonna put more pressure on that, which is gonna be more painful. And it's ultimately not sustainable, because you're not teaching them lifelong habits, which are sustainable over time. Because we have to change their behavior and their relationship with food.
I was going to say that I think it could be like a temporary relief, like well, yes, you implement this, you get them to lose the weight you need for them to be in a better position. maybe if we think about someone who's very, very overweight, severely overweight, perhaps they like five weeks in a very huge calorie deficit won't be as detrimental as someone who is a little bit leaner, because they have a lot of body fat to lose. So they will be sort of maintaining part of the lean body mass much more than someone who is much leaner. But I guess this is like another catch-22. What is the right thing to do, especially with the client? They have a very poor dietary habits, very poor lifestyle in general, the choices they make. Doing this very fast, rapid fat loss or rapid weight loss, because I don't think sometimes it is actually only fat loss involved in there, that's a problem. We're not teaching them things or skills that they need to use for the rest of their lives, and they will probably lose weight very quickly. They'll have the surgery, but then they will be in their head, because there was so much deprivation and restriction in the weeks leading to the surgery, that then after the surgery they think, well, I deserve now everything I want. And
Yes.
then they start binging on food and regaining the weight. And because on top of that, they are feeling their need is going to go, the basal metabolic rate is going to go higher because of the recovery because of the surgery. There are going to be things that they are not going to be able to perceive or control. It is going just to be an automatic increase of hunger, whilst the restriction they had before is like potentiating a cascade of behaviors that they are not going to identify as a very red flags. So I guess that's a very important point, like really looking at as an approach that allows them to have some behavior change. Same with bariatric surgery patients. Like you want them to have a time where they actually start getting into the habits and learning the skills they will need to do after surgery as well. Because it's not just about losing the weight they need, get the surgery done, and then goodbye, chao pescado, te veo mañana. So it's like you really need to pay attention to the whole scenario, and before, during, and after. So I guess I really like the approach you mentioned, because it is not just about an outcome of weight, but it's also a lifestyle behavior change that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest thing for people to understand and grasp. I mean, even our normal weight loss clients, everybody wants to lose weight, and in fact, losing weight is not really that hard, as you know it. But keep it off for a year or 2 years or 5 years. That's where the biggest challenge is, and I think that's where we need to do better in educating our clients and the people that we work with, our patients, so that they don't have that rebound effect and they can actually make lifelong changing habits.
I agree. Now, let's move to something that I am very interested to talk about with you, and it is about nutrition research. I guess one of my main goals for this show is to make things that are difficult much simpler and make them so accessible that people who are trying to understand nutrition and research, they can actually access it in a much more simpler way that they can understand, to at least get them started. Oh, this is what it's all about, before they actually get so confused, because nutrition by itself is already very well confusing, with things going, well, you do it this way, no, now it's a different way, eat 5 eggs a day, now you can only eat 1 egg a day. Like, it is so contradictory and confusing that research might come across like, well, what's the truth behind the research? When should I trust a paper? When should I not trust it? So when it comes to research, what are the challenges you find doing nutrition research, before we actually move into what the different types of research types are, and what is, there must be some good and bad pros and cons for each one of them. So I'll let you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're right. Nutrition research in general it can be very confusing, and there's a lot of information that you need to be able to identify. But I think there are a lot of challenges when you are a researcher, and one of them is, for example, your ability to recruit your participants, number one. As you know, most of the research is usually done at the universities, which means that a lot of the research, not everything, but a lot of the research happens to be done on college age, traditional college age students. So of course, if you have deeper funding and you're able to maybe pay other participants, you may now be able to recruit outside of that, and you may be able to pay people a stipend to be able to come in and do a longer term study. And those are done all the time as well, but they are more challenging because usually now people that are not in school and they're working full time, well, they typically have full-time jobs, they have families, they have a lot of responsibilities. So to be able to commit to come into a laboratory 2, 3, 4 days a week can be fairly challenging. The other thing that's really challenging with research, especially in nutrition research, the most meaningful type of research is chronic longitudinal research that happens over time, because that actually tells us a story. Acute research is good. So measuring like acute muscle protein synthesis is great. It tells the beginning of the story, but it doesn't tell us the whole thing. You know, does increasing muscle protein synthesis acutely over time, does that actually build more muscle? Well, we actually know it doesn't necessarily mean that, right? It just means that we have increased muscle protein synthesis over time. So doing those longer term chronic studies can be very challenging. Going back in the college setting, you're usually limited to maybe 8, 10, 12 weeks. If you're really lucky, maybe doing a 16-week, because that's how long the semesters are. On top of that, you have to usually recruit people beforehand. So if you have a 60-week long semester, it might take me 2 or 3 weeks to recruit people to get into my study. And then it may, or longer, sometimes it may take several months, right? I might have to plan this for the semester before to start the semester after to be able to do some of this. And then I have to take them through this program and then hope that people don't drop out. So college students will drop out. And if college students that maybe have a little more time on their hands drop out, what do you think are going to happen to the people that are working, that have families and have other responsibilities? Going to that research lab 3 or 4 days a week might not be the #1 priority. So the attrition rate is very high with a lot of these. So it's really difficult to keep people in a study. The next component that's very challenging is keeping people accountable. All right. So if you're giving a certain intervention, even if you're not giving them a nutritional intervention, maybe you just want them on maintenance calories. Well, if I'm doing 2 different exercise interventions, I need to make sure that I'm having a similar type of nutrition with both groups, because if group A is eating 500 calories less than maintenance compared to the other group, they're going to have a different outcome just because the nutrition is different. So we have to basically make sure that we're controlling a lot of these variables. So controlling a free living person's nutrition patterns is very difficult, even if you provide guidance. And then with that comes, how effective are they in reporting what they're giving? So maybe I give them a lesson, maybe I give them a coach, I give them a weight scale, I teach them how to measure things. But now, are they actually doing that? Are they eyeballing it? As we know from nutrition research, people typically overestimate what they eat and underestimate how much they move. Hopefully, with a little guidance and some direction, those errors are minimized. But those are all major challenges. So sometimes when you start with a pool of say 30, 40 people, you might get a dropout rate of 20, 30% of those that will finish the study. And then on top of that, you have to kind of figure out how are you going to track all of these things. So if you're tracking nutrition variables, I've done several of these longer studies, and they are challenging because I literally have to have them report to an individual on a every other day or every week, and they have to turn in what they've eaten, and we have to monitor the calories, the protein, the carbohydrates, the fats, and we have to do that for every individual over and over again. So that means it takes a lot of resources, because if you're just one researcher, you can't possibly monitor 40 people every week. So you're going to need research assistants to be able to do that, and that requires money. So money is another limitation. So really, there are a lot of big challenges when it comes to nutrition. So when you read that study that's published, as a reviewer, that's one thing that I always appreciate a lot when I see the amount of effort that they actually were able to complete the whole process and control all those variables, and understand that there are going to be some limitations within certain research protocols. Some researchers might not follow a weekly protocol because it may be too difficult. So they may do a 3-day recall of what people ate in week 1, at week 4, at week 8. And really, now you're basically assuming that those 3 diet recalls or 1-day diet recalls, 24, is exactly what they ate during the entire 12-week process. And that might not be the case. So those are all limitations that we have to be careful with when we're reading and interpreting research. And just know that there are inherent limitations. It's part of what comes with the territory.
I agree. I think this is a great way to sort of delve into what are the different types of studies. You mentioned the longitudinal studies. We have like statistical studies, more like the ones that are based on statistics. We always have the systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, cross-sectional studies. Which one of those, all of those type of studies are really relevant to when it comes to nutrition? And what are some of the pros and cons when we think about, well, like if we look at correlation is not necessarily causation. Some of these studies that are based on statistics probably are not necessarily very good to sort of talk about an important issue or give some actual recommendations on specific things, because they are not necessarily giving you the whole story. They're just giving you some correlations. So there's not really a really good pattern to see whether this actually is happening in real life. If we have like the easy example of someone eating meat, and that can meat causes cancer, because like obviously if you correlate that people who generally eat meat will be someone who maybe smokes, works a lot, is more sedentary, but they're not taking into account all of these other different factors. They're just associating meat causes cancer because the people who ate more meat, they were more likely to be more at risk, a higher risk of cancer. But is that how much truth is behind that? So I'll let you to sort of talk a little bit about the different study types and what is each one good for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think whenever you have a research question, I think part of it depends on how much research has been done on a particular topic. Often when there's very little evidence in any particular topic, that's when you maybe can begin with maybe looking at correlations, because you're just basically studying what's already out there. You're not necessarily doing interventions and seeing, okay, is there any type of relationship that may exist or may not exist? But taking that into account, that like you said before, correlation does not mean causation. So you need to take into account these other confounding variables that may affect these correlations. Because ultimately, there's, we could say it's like, if you drive 10 hours a day versus if you drive, people that drive longer are going to have a higher rate of accidents than people drive shorter. Well, of course, they're on the road more, right? They're exposed more. So the more exposure you have, so that's a confounding variable. Those are part of the things that you have to look at. But it's a good starting point to kind of begin to see where relationships may lie, and maybe to what's being done. So right now, a lot of my research is in bodybuilding and physique sports. It's very hard to work with bodybuilders over a 12-period time and to recruit them to come in and participate in a study. So we're left with observational studies. So I'm observing what they're already doing. I'm not intervening. I'm just seeing what are they doing right now. And then from there, we can maybe develop other hypotheses later. But those are definitely the weaker type of studies that you're gonna find. It's not to say that they're insignificant. It's just that we can't draw a lot of definitive conclusions from those. It's just kind of a starting point to dive into further research. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the meta-analyses, which are now they cluster different studies that are done on these particular topics. So maybe there's a lot of research on creatine would be a good example. There's a lot of research on creatine monohydrate and its effectiveness. So we could look at the effectiveness of creatine monohydrate on increasing strength. And we could pull up probably hundreds and hundreds of studies that have looked at those variables specifically. And then from there, now we're not just looking at one study, we're looking at literally hundreds of studies that meet the criteria. You can even focus it to a population, and there's a lot of research on it. You can do males or females, different age groups, if it's been studied thoroughly. So now you can narrow it down, but at the end of the day, you're basically looking at, it's more than one article. You're looking at an accumulation of all of these different articles done in different labs, done in various settings, and then you can actually see a trend into what's happening. You know, so the trend for strength in creatine, for example, it says like, well, yeah, it actually works. You take creatine, and yeah, it's not just one study, it's hundreds of studies that shows that there's a positive effect on creatine and strength, for example. So those are made up of usually randomized control trials, which are another strong study. But again, those are only a piece of the puzzle. So just because you have one randomized control trial that shows a positive effect of an intervention, that doesn't mean that that's now a fact, right? It just tells you we have a piece of evidence that suggests that this may be something that is going on. Now, if you start piecing 3, 4, 5, 10 of these together, and you can do a meta-analysis, and then they all tend to agree together, now we have more data to support, and it's basically a higher level of evidence that we can actually maybe bite into a little bit more. So randomized control trials are great because they're able to do that. But within those, we have different types of randomized control trials. You know, ideally, the ones that I like to do are the ones that are crossover trials, where you have the same individual do the same intervention, but then this requires a caveat. It's a complicated process because you're going to usually have to do some sort of washout period, and you're going to have to get the individual to come in for maybe 8 or 12 weeks to do the intervention A, wash out for 8 to 12 weeks, and then do intervention B for another 8 to 12 weeks. But the reason I like those is because there was a lot of inter-individual differences between people, and because you're testing me against me, all of those variables are going to be accounted for, those differences. But if we just have two groups, which is the most common way to do it because it's the most practical, we have group A and group B doing the different interventions. It still be double-blind, placebo-controlled, which are good quality measures. But at those, what you're dealing with is now you may have people that are going to be non-responders or hyper-responders, and there's a lot of inter-individual differences between those. So that being said, when you're interpreting the data, it's important to understand looking at the individual. So don't just look at the means, look over to the right at the standard deviations, because if the standard deviations are very big, then it shows you that there's a lot of variability within that. So it's more important to look at the individual results and kind of see what happens, because you may have one person that's a hyper responder that drives your mean up and making that intervention statistically significant when it really wasn't. Maybe only one person hyper responded and the other 15 people barely responded at all. But the mean made it get to a point of statistical significant difference. So those are some of the nuances in research and reading the research and understanding some of the limitations with the research.
Oh, that's incredible. I think when it comes to research, again, there's so much nuances and details that it can be very, very difficult to sort of sometimes trust in, or like for someone who is already beginning to get into research, just to read nutrition information, what's the most optimal way to do it and understand nutrition, or even fitness, or whatever you want to go into the evidence-based space. You really want to sort of know, where should I look? Where is the best place that I can find information that is reliable and I can understand it? So the other point that I would just bring up very quickly, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about, is when it comes to biases, and obviously the point of like funding, because there's a lot of debate on, well, if you have a good research but the research is funded by a company, then how much trust you should be putting in this paper. But sometimes, because research is so difficult, and sometimes you need funding from from whatever it could come to actually put the study running and do whatever you need to do. When can you trust the study, even regardless of the, like, is that another catch-22? Like, is that funding something that is going to affect the trustworthy of the study, or might not necessarily be? Like, it might just be that they are putting the money because they want research out. They might even if they're sort of in the same field, like if about protein or like, let's say, meat and cancer, but the company who is founding the study is maybe, I don't know, a meat industry, from the meat industry. Now, like, how much should I trust this study? Because people that are not very convinced that this study might show what they want to hear, even if it's proving what should be proving, they are going to say, well, this study is funded by the meat industry, so why should I trust this study? They want to show what they want to show, but maybe they showing what they should be showing. So I don't know. I guess I don't know if I make it so confusing, but do you know where I want to get from here? Is like, how do you trust the funding sources, or how do you deal with these potential things and biases?
I hope you enjoyed these episodes, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much.
Okay, so to answer the question about conflict of interest is what the topic is really. It's a great question, and I think there's a few things that we want to address with that. Number one is we want to make sure that whenever your research is funded, that you publicly disclose that, and you publicly disclose that hey, there is or is there not a conflict of interest with your funding. I've been involved in a couple of research projects, a handful of them actually, that have been externally funded by the companies wanting to investigate their products. But as I stated before, if I have to run a research lab and I have to pay research assistants and I have to have product and I have to provide them with maybe protein or other things, I have to buy food scales. I have to get supplies to be able to run the tests. So if I'm doing blood samples, for example, I need to be able to buy all of the equipment to be able to run those blood samples, and that costs money. It's not free. The school's not going to give it to me for free. They're going to expect me to fund the research. So who else is going to pay for it otherwise, right? Only a particular company is going to be able to do that, and a company of interest. So that being said, I don't think there's anything wrong with companies funding research, and I think the important thing is disclosing that there was a funding source and what that is and what that relationship was. But one thing that I think we have to always put it back is on the researchers, and most, I'm going to say, a majority of researchers are going to be very ethical, and we have our careers that we want to focus on. We have our reputation to focus on, and really, if you violate the ethical component of data management and misrepresent information inappropriately, well, then now what's your research worth? Because now you're really not reporting much. So to me, personally, I value my reputation and I value my ethical standards, and I think most researchers do the same. So that being said, why would you essentially sacrifice your career for this funding? To do one of the labs or one of the experiments that you're running. So I think when you put the responsibility back on the investigator, then I think it actually can alleviate some of those issues. One thing that I do as an investigator, when somebody approaches me, if they want to do a study on a particular product that they're looking at, or that their company manufactures, I always tell them, okay, well, there's no guarantees. They can help me with the research design, and they can help me with certain parts of the project. They can approve it, but they're going to have no part in the data collection. They're going to have no part in the data analysis. Those are all independently done. And in fact, usually because they're double-blind type of experiments, then even I don't know who's getting the intervention, and the people involved in the research don't know who's getting the intervention. And that's the beauty of a double-blind type of study, is that the people that are doing the intervention, they don't know what they're getting. They don't know if they're getting a placebo or the active ingredient. And I don't know what I'm giving to them, if I'm giving them the active ingredient or the placebo. So everything is blindly labeled, to the point where really, how can I manipulate the data when I don't know, or how can I bias these groups in one way or another when I really don't know who's getting what, right? So those are all ways which you can kind of double check yourself to be able to do that.
Okay, that's awesome. Now, because I'm conscious of your time, I'm going to ask you one more question. And I really like to go about the study you worked on female athletes in 2016 that was looking into nutrition considerations in this population. So what are some of the takeaways that you have from this study that are relevant for this population? And after we talk a little bit about that, what do you think when it comes to eating disorders, especially like REDS, or like the female triad? What, in your opinion, what would be the real cause of this problem? Is that because of lack of energy availability, or is it because of excessive stress and training volume, or intensity, lack of recovery, or a little bit of everything?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that was actually a really fun paper. It was a review article that I did for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, and it was actually for the female. It was a female athlete special issue. So it just focused on different issues with regards to strength and conditioning and nutrition for females. But that article was good, and I focused on nutritional recommendations for female athletes, which was really kind of specifically targeted at looking at the nutritional practices of females, and then some of the occurrences that we may see with some of the athletes, female athletes in particular. So some of the takeaway points is we know that typically female athletes compared to non-athletes typically have higher prevalence of these eating disorders and body image issues, body dissatisfaction issues, specifically the ones that are in more aesthetically type of geared sports, things such as synchronized swimming, things like cheerleading, things like gymnastics, where how they look is a large part of how they perform and how they are judged. So that was actually a key component. In addition, those that are like long distance runners, endurance driven type of female athletes, they're also on the radar for disordered eating and eating disorders. And some people get that confused. What's disordered eating and what's an eating disorder? But I always like to clarify that that they're not the same thing. They sound the same, but an actual eating disorder means you actually are clinically diagnosed and you meet the diagnostic criteria for those. Whereas disordered eating means that you're maybe on your way there, but you're not quite there yet, but you still have maybe an unhealthy relationship with food and with exercise. So that would be in a very general sense what that means. But athletes are dealing with those with regards to the RED-S, which is the relative energy, the lack of energy availability, essentially. Yes, relative energy deficiency in sport. Took my words, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what we see, is that they basically don't have. They're exercising so much that they're not consuming enough energy to make up for those calories. So a lot of this, I think, it's a combination of all of the things that we're talking about, which is basically they're not consuming enough calories in general. They're also burning too many calories by doing excessive, not only volume, but also intensity of training. And then lack of recovery, thus leading to the RED-S syndrome, which is basically the female athlete triad. And then you have a lot of problems with that. My biggest concern with these athletes are particularly the younger athletes, just because of the amount of impact that it's going to have on their health later in life. because as we know, during that period of adolescence is when you're primarily going to be developing your lean muscle mass, your bones are developing. And if you are not consuming enough calories and you're training excessively and not recovering enough, you're going to essentially inhibit your ability to build that lean body mass and your bone mass as well, your bone mineral density, which is going to come back and haunt you later in life in your 40s, your 50s, and your 60s. Because if you don't have a good foundation in your early teens and into your 20s, then that's going to set you up for potentially more failure when you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s. So that population, I think, is very important. I think another big component of that paper was that what drives these type of body dissatisfaction, and a lot of that is societal pressure, just from them growing up. Is like what do they see on TV as being glorified, and everything from models to Barbie dolls. What is considered an ideal body, and they have to struggle with that. What's considered sexy? What's considered appealing? Dealing with all of those pressures makes it very, very difficult. Not to mention the pressures that we often get from parents themselves and coaches on top of that, where they're driving these young girls to be competitive, to maybe lose those extra pounds because that's going to impact their performance in their gymnastics or their running. And therefore, they're getting information maybe from inappropriate sources, because a lot of times coaches are not trained in nutrition. Parents often are not trained in nutrition. So they're giving these individuals, these young girls, faulty information. And then that's just making the problem that much worse.
And when it comes to like looking at nutrition deficiencies, why iron, calcium, and vitamin D seems to be so important in female athletes?
Well, those are usually part of them. The nutritional deficiencies usually come from primarily a lack of just energy intake, period. So they're just not consuming enough calories. And then, of course, when they're cutting back a lot of these calories, they're going to be cutting back in often the foods that are going to be rich in some of these primary micronutrients that we're talking about. But of course, one example might be, well, like we saw the documentary Game Changers, for example, right? And you see maybe athletes that are going to be watching this, and you may be seeing young girls that are watching this, and now they're going to say, it's like, well, I need to become a vegan and I need to eliminate all of these food sources. So then now we have to look at, in general, what if they're not doing things correctly, right? Because you can be a successful vegan athlete and you can do okay, but it requires a lot of work on the athlete's part, a lot of education, a lot of commitment. But sometimes as a young athlete, you might think, okay, well, I'm just not going to eat meat. Well, so then what are they eating? Well, now they're eating French fries and Coke, and that's their diet. And it doesn't have the complete proteins. They're not getting adequate amounts of the actual nutrients that they need, especially as an athlete. So iron, it comes to mind just because the first one, it's important as an athlete because it's going to be the primary transporter for your hemoglobin and your myoglobin, which is very critical. So you're going to need to make sure that you have enough iron. Same thing with calcium and vitamin D. They're going to be important in bone mineralization. They're going to be important in your strength development. So if you have a deficit in those particular micronutrients, it's going to not only impede your ability to perform well, but it's going to also potentially impede your health in general. And the one thing that I was talking about iron is that with iron, we have the non-heme and heme iron, and a lot of the heme iron is found primarily in animal products, whereas the non-heme iron is primarily found in the green leafy vegetables. But the non-heme iron, the heme iron is the one that our body can absorb better and can actually utilize for that. So even if you're getting enough iron from your veggies, well, that's great, but all of that is non-heme iron. It's not the heme iron that your body can actually readily absorb. So that makes it very difficult. And if you're cutting out other foods like the dairy, now you're cutting out the calcium, and you're also cutting out a lot of that dairy is also fortified with the vitamin D, which makes it very easy to be deficient in those major micronutrients.
I agree. Now, moving to future projects, what are some of the things you're planning to do for in the next year or so? New research, new papers coming out.
So right now, I'm actually working on. I have one really exciting paper that's under review that I co-authored with Brad Schoenfeld, Alan Aragon, Chris Barakat, and Scott Stevenson, and it's basically a review paper on evidence-based nutritional recommendations for peak week for bodybuilders. So that's an exciting paper that's currently under review. I also did collect data between 2018 to 2019 on different bodybuilders. I have a couple of case studies, and I have both female and male athletes. So we're looking at body composition and some of their nutrition, drug practices, training practices. So we're right now I'm in the process of basically organizing my data, and I'm going to be writing up that over the next few months here. And then I have some new projects that I want to start, but right now everything's kind of on hold. So once we get back in school, and hopefully I can actually put in some new IRBs and then get some projects running to collect more new data.
Awesome. Well, Guillermo, thank you so much for having spent this time with me, talking about so many things. I think it's a lot of information that people will benefit from. Where people could find you, and yeah, where is the best place to get in touch with you?
Great. Well, my Instagram handle is at Dr. GFit. It's all spelled out, so at Dr. GFit, and that's the same as my Facebook as well. And then you can also find me via my university, which is California State University, San Bernardino. So that's csusb.edu. I am in the kinesiology department there, and I am also part of the College of Natural Sciences. I'm a current Dean Fellow there for the College of Natural Sciences. So those are probably the best ways you can reach me. And lastly, if you want to read my research, I would say you can follow me on ResearchGate as well, because I usually post all of my open access papers up on there, or I'll even post some of the abstracts for the ones that are not open access.
Oh, so good. Well, thank you so much, Guillermo. You have a lovely night, and be good boy, and I'll see you very soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below, and I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.